One of the first questions we always ask is, give us your name, when you were born, and where you were born.
Carl Hardesty, September 24th, 1930, in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
Did you grow up in Canada?
No. My parents were American citizens. We were there, I think we left when I was 3. My birth certificate even shows that parents were born where they were born. So I am a citizen. I've been back to Canada once in the Navy, and then my wife and I went to Alaska and went through Canada. It's the only times I've ever been back.
So being born there, then you just kind of...
Yeah.
Where'd you live here in the country?
Well, to begin with, my dad couldn't stay put. We lived in 17 states before I went in the Navy at 17. And we were constantly on the move, which is one reason that I want roots. I don't move. I had enough of that as a kid. When the war started, the Second World War, we lived in South Dakota. That's where every once in a while I could see a newsreel at the movie, and the submarine service was the most glamorous thing that you could do. I always wanted to be in submarines.
That's amazing. What was it about the submarines that captured your interest?
I guess that not everybody did it. I'm still that way. I like to do I'm adventurous. I like to try new things. In some ways I'm adventurous. I started being an electrician with my dad in South Dakota. And for almost 45 years, that's the work that I did. So I like to stay put. But other than that, I like to do different things. I lived near Joplin, Missouri when I went in the Navy. I was on a waiting list for 6 months to get in. They weren't just taking everybody whenever you wanted in. But when it was finally my turn to go and take the physical, Mom and Dad put me on the train in Joplin to go to Kansas City for the physical exam. My mother made me promise 3 things: no drinking, no tattoos, and no submarines. I batted 1,000. I got my first tattoo when I was still in boot camp. And my mother for years, was going to save all her money to get that tattoo removed. And now, I've got 7 tattoos. I advise anybody, don't do it. You just disfigure yourself. And those things, I don't care what kind of ink or what kind of pencils they use on it, it fades and spreads. And it looks ugly. You go to a beach or a swimming pool, and the little kids they're looking at the moving pictures as you're going by. And I see some of these people are tattoos all over their upper torso, on their neck, on their face. Ridiculous. And if you get it off with laser, you can do it, but that scars you too. So that was part of the reasons for doing some of the things that I did. And another thing, my dad was assured me before I ever went in that with my attitude towards him, that I'd never last in the Navy. I'd be in the brig within 2 weeks. Well, I had to prove him wrong on that, but I found that the Navy, when I was in, that was what I should have been doing. When I was in boot camp, I wanted to be an electrician. That's what I put down. In the old diesel submarines, the electricians had the most prolonged or protracted job you could have because of the taking care of the batteries. And it was hard to get people to stay in that rank, in that work. They even bypassed sending me to submarine school and put me directly aboard a sub because I wanted to be an electrician. And within 9 months of going aboard, I had my dolphins. I loved the submarine service. It was exciting to me always.
Now explain, you had your dolphins. What is that?
The insignia that you wear on your to signify that you have learned every system and learned everybody's job aboard ship. You've had to draw all of the air and electrical systems, the ventilating systems, battery systems. You knew the boat from one end to the other. And you could do any job except maybe the captain's job. You even had to stand watch on the helm, stand with the officer of the deck when you were at sea and get instructions there. I don't think I was conning the ship or anything, but you still had to learn what was going on there.
What year did you go in?
February 2nd of 1948. I wasn't quite, well, I'd have been 18 in September of 48.
What was the submarine that you went aboard?
The Cayman 323, stationed out at Pearl. To begin with, out of boot camp, they sent me up to Mare Island at Vallejo. And for about 2 weeks, they had me helping chip paint on submarines that they were decommissioning. And one afternoon, about 2 o'clock, they came and got me and 2 other guys and said, we're headed back to taking you back to the barracks. In 3 hours, you have to be ready to go to Pearl Harbor. Didn't know we thought we'd send us on a ship, but they didn't. An admiral had a 4-engine seaplane, and he was headed for Hawaii. Up on the top where he was at, it was plush. Where the enlisted men were, it was glorified lawn chairs that we rode in. But when they put us aboard there, within 3 hours, we had to clean up, no food or anything. We started off across Oakland Bay. And they hadn't briefed us kids on anything. And all of a sudden, flame and smoke was coming out from under the wings of that airplane. And as big as that plane was, it took a long ways for it to take off. But what they had on there was what they called JATO, Jet Assisted Takeoff. And that really lifted that plane up. But we thought that we were all doomed. It took 14 hours to get to Pearl. Again, it was a memorable trip for me. I'd been up in a small plane a couple of times, but something like that, man, a warbird. And it was really thrilling for an old farm kid. We landed at Hickam Field. In 48, not all of the damage from the attack on December 7th had been restored. There were still a lot of buildings that hadn't been rebuilt. And of course, there were still a lot of the derelicts out in the bay, too. When we had to sail past the Arizona every time we went to sea. We always had a contingent on deck saluting as we went by. It might have been just the line handlers that weren't sent below yet, but when we went by there, we saluted every time. So to me, that's always been a memorial I would hate to see them send divers down to go into that hulk. I don't think that that's a thing to do.
That had to be really something, and you say there were other damaged ships.
Yeah.
It had to be quite a feeling that you'd heard about all of this, and
Yeah.
to see it.
Oh, it was. To me, I was experiencing history, and I knew I was, and I was all caught up in it. I guess I'm very patriotic. My country, right or wrong, always. I don't approve of the wrong, but it's still my country.
I want to go back to when you went into the Navy first and the submarines. What was it like when you submerged for the first time?
They took maybe half a dozen of us off of the base, wanting to see if we really wanted to go on a submarine. They took us out for our first ride. So they took us down and put us in the cruise quarters, just aft of the mess hall, and said, "Now you wait here, we'll come and get you." Well, we heard the engines going, and there's some vibration, and about an hour later, one of the ship's crew went by, and I was the only one brave enough to ask what was going on. And I said, "Well, when are we going to dive?" Well, he thought that was hilarious. He said, "We dove a half hour ago. What's there to worry about?" And from then on, it was set in stone. That's what I was going to do, and no question. In order to qualify, they had to run you through the depth chamber, bathysgraph, whatever you call it, to see if you could take the pressure. Well, the first time through, I ruptured my eardrums. I thought, oh man, I'm out. 6 weeks later, they were healed up. I went through it again, and probably part of it, I wasn't knowing how to equalize the pressure. And I passed it, and nothing happened, and 2-3 days later, I was aboard ship. The electrician were so short-staffed. In the Navy, you had to do 2 months of mess cooking, KP. Everybody had to do it, or on submarines anyway. I was on there for 2 weeks and did the mess cooking. And magically I got off and I was back in the electrical crew because they really needed me. They were doubling up on watches.
What kind of duties, where were you when you went out from Pearl?
The first year that I was on, before I got my first stripe, I was in the control room. In the control room is the switchboard. It's probably a little bit taller than me and about 6 feet long, full of switches and fuses, and all of it open fuses at the time. And for whatever was going on, you had to know which of those switches to open or close for each occurrences. That took a while to learn that too. Of course, that went along with the qualification to earn your dolphins. But that was where you stood your watch. That and carry coffee back to the maneuvering room where the electricians controlled the propulsion. Or carry coffee to the people in the control room, whatever. You were just a kind of a gopher. It's fine. I loved it.
How many men were aboard your submarine crew?
We had about 80, if you were full complement.
What's the size of a submarine? You know, we get a mixed thing seeing the movies, which is a farce.
The cobia, which you see behind me here, 311 feet long. And I think from the keel to the top of the periscope shears, not the periscope, about 50 feet. And I forget what the beam was. 30 feet, maybe 35. I'm not sure on that anymore. 1,500 tons, which is not very big anymore. Now, the first time we went from Pearl to Panama, we were to escort the queenfish, which was the guppy snorkel, from around where it had been converted. I think it was in New London, Groton. And she was being escorted also by an aircraft carrier, and we surfaced close to that. I couldn't imagine how huge a ship could be and still float. And they're minor now. They're awfully small in comparison. I was really impressed with the size of that aircraft carrier. This is another interesting little sidelight of my experience. The Russians dearly wanted to see what the queenfish looked like. And they had a submarine in the area trying to get some pictures of it. Our assignment was to dog this Russian submarine to keep it away. We followed that for very close to 2 weeks, trying to keep it away. We were at battle stations most of the time. Our torpedoes were armed, and had we been able to be in a position, we were supposed to take it out. That's something that's little known, but I guess that's what we were supposed to do. At all costs, keep that submarine away from the queenfish.
Now, how were they going to take pictures of...
Oh, you had all kinds of cameras that could be attached to the periscopes. They had really sophisticated photography equipment. Some of it they had during the war. Well, what they had after when I was in was development from what they had then. And they took really good pictures. And I'm sure that the Russians had just as good as we did. But the queenfish was one of the first ones that had the big sail. And had the snorkel so that they could run submerged.
Just describe a little bit for somebody who doesn't understand submarines, what the sail and the snorkel is all about.
Well, the sail is the part that's stuck up above the deck. That's where the officers and the lookouts stood their watch and controlled the direction of the ship. The sail on the guppy snorkels was streamlined so that there was less noise created by the sub going through the water, and make it more streamlined so that it would go easier. Also, it was a little bit taller than the old fleet boats, which gave them a bigger area of for lookouts to see. Because the higher you are, the further out that you can see. The snorkel was incorporated in this sail, and it was a hydraulically operated telescoping tube that you could be down at, I think, 90 feet. And you could send this, that's the bottom of the keel of the ship, down 90 feet. And you could send this snorkel up and open it up to the air, and you could pull in enough outside air to run your diesel engines submerged. It was also designed so that if a wave went over that, it automatically closed, so you didn't get the salt water down in the engines, which instantaneously took you from maybe sea level to 15,000, 16,000 feet. And it was hard on your ears. You had to learn how to breathe and equalize, and you never knew when it was going to happen. the worse the water was, the more times it closed. It did give you a much less radar profile than than trying to be up at periscope depth. I don't know if the atomic boats nowadays have a snorkel. I have no idea. They've got a small diesel engine aboard with a generator that they could maintain surface speed if they had to. But I don't know that they have a snorkel.
Kind of describe it, once again, going back for people who aren't maybe familiar with submarines that much. These boats at this time have the diesel engine and they have the batteries. And describe kind of how you would operate between the two engines and how long you could stay under work off the batteries.
On the boats that I was on, the screws were driven by electric motors. Doesn't make any difference if you were running with the diesels or not. There were still electric motors. The old German boats had a one shaft with a clutch. You could run the screws directly from the diesel engines. We could not on our boats. It was strictly electrically operated. On the end of each of the 4 diesel engines was a big generator. You could run your electric motors directly from the generators, or the generators could be used to recharge your batteries, or whatever combination you needed to do. If you were under wartime conditions, normally you would keep, to begin with, you'd have to have 2 engines to start your battery charge, to get enough power to put in there. And then you'd be cut down to 1, but the other engines would be for propulsion. We had 2 batteries of 126 cells each. Each cell, or each battery could put out 250 volts DC. You could series those 2 batteries and you could get 500 volts. That's if you had to go flank speed or really had to do some fast maneuvering. The batteries were a constant work. Unlike the electricity that is in a house or in a building, one side of the line is grounded. Aboard ship, you don't want any grounded electricity. It's too dangerous to the personnel with the metal ship. So you constantly were, as you were charging, you were creating gases and moisture, and in that battery compartment it would condense, and you'd wind up with sulfuric acid. And this would seep down between the cells. And eventually it could, if you didn't keep your battery wells clean, you would be shorting out everything. And we had things that we could detect whether there was a ground on the batteries or not. And I can remember times that maybe 72 hours straight, the whole electrical crew was in those 2 battery wells trying to clear the ground. And all of a sudden you didn't know what you did, nobody had any idea. Somebody put the soda or the water in the right spot and it cleared it. So then but you stood your regular watch, and when you weren't on watch, you were down there cleaning the batteries. The electricians had a special clothing allowance because being down in the battery wells as much as you were, the battery acid ate your clothes. And you kept one set of dungarees until they just fell off of you. And then you'd get another, but I forget what the allowance was. It was adequate. You always kept a bunch of dungarees because you were very cautious on what you wore in the battery well. We had some privileges being electricians. The days that you had duty, when you'd come into port, you had to charge batteries. Therefore, you didn't have to stand another watch. That was the watch that you... But instead of, say, for 4 hours, you probably were 8 hours on the battery charge.
How long were you out on the various?
There have been times, 2.5, 3 months at a time. The only thing that brought us back in was lack of food. That we've been out at times where we refueled our diesel from other ships. During the 48 and 49, we were pretty much on a war footing. Yeah, we were constantly at sea.
At this time, you mentioned the one incident where the Soviets were tracking this one boat. Were the Soviets generally tracking you when you would go out on a patrol? And were you aware of that?
Not that I'm aware of. That was the only time that I'm really aware of it. I'm sure that they were there, but that's the only time I was really aware of it.
And if you were submerged, how long could you stay under with the equipment that you had?
With judicious use of your battery, maybe 72 to 80 hours. But also by that time, the air was getting foul. We had special CO2 absorbent canisters that you could spread this chemical out like on the bunks, and it would absorb the CO2, which helped. But very seldom did we stay down that much. Once in a while we had to. There's something else I'd like to mention, and to make a short story long, let me put it this way. My wife and I have been married for 53 years. Over that period of years, I have tried to convince her that a ship has a personality. She laughed at me. I went a step further and I tried to convince her that some ships are jinxed. They've got some kind of an evil spirit to them. And I've had an experience on the Cayman that I felt was that way, but we went through Alabama and stopped at the War Memorial there, and they had the battleship Alabama. We went aboard it. As soon as we stepped on the ship, my wife said she could feel something. She talked to some other people that were on there, and they felt it too. And I definitely did. I felt a presence every compartment that I went to. I could feel it. But the Cayman was a jinxed ship. If anything could go wrong, it went wrong on the Cayman. And I can think of, half a dozen incidents that happened. The very first one was I hadn't been aboard a couple of months. Didn't know what was danger and what wasn't. And we went out, and we'd been in yard overhaul. A submarine, to maintain its equilibrium, has to be balanced. Everything has to be accounted for. So we went out and made our initial dive, which was the only one we made that day. But somebody had trimmed that, with the forward trim tank, 10,000 gallons of seawater, more than they knew. We started down. Of course, we started getting a big down angle, and the bow planes quit working. The hydraulic went out on them. And we were going down like a rock. And I don't know, the indicator, the bubble, like a level, was 35 degrees. We lost the bubble in the end, so we were more than 35-degree down angle. And we were going down fast. Things were falling out of the lockers, and people were falling all over the place. And finally the skipper said, okay, full astern. So they backed up, which started pulling us back up. He left it on too long, and we started down stern first. At that time, it blew every one of even the fuel tanks. And we did pop to the surface. The next time or two that we were in a yard upkeep, they had a new engineman working on the after engine room hatch. There was some rust on it. And he took it apart. You know, the worm gear and all this to get the rust off of it and oil it up, put it back together. And we went out and dove. And as soon as you put a pressure in the boat, positive pressure. And that was one cog off on that big 36-inch hole. And the pressure in the boat raised that hatch up enough so that 36 inches of hole was flooding water into that after engine room. And we got down far enough and the outside pressure sealed it. And then when they went up there and discovered what the problem was, well, we had to go back up through that area where it was going to lift up and flood again. Only way you could do it. No way of stopping it from lifting off. So again, that was the only dive we made that day. Went in and fixed things. Shortly before we went to Alaska, they were charging batteries, and I think they were using the engines in the after engine room. Between the crew's quarters and the forward engine room is a watertight door. Between each engine room is a watertight door. And those engines really pull a lot of air. And for some reason, the induction valve got closed. And the below decks watch was making his patrol, and he went into the after crew's quarters into the head area and just hit the latch on that watertight door, and it sucked him and the metal partitions on that crew's lavatory and all right in on top of him. Those are the three that I can think of right up, but there was more of them on the Cayman that happened.
What happened to him?
He was in the hospital for weeks. He had a severe concussion, head injury, other cuts on him. He was lucky. We went to Hunters Point in San Francisco for a yard overhaul on the Cayman. And as much as everybody likes Hawaii, to me, it's an island. I didn't like it. I wanted off of an island. The Manta was being rebuilt in the same yard. I was going to go to Key West, Florida. It's okay. I was third class by the time. And on the Cayman, I was kind of excess. They had oversupply of third class. So they okayed me to transfer to the Manta, which was fine. I got what I wanted. But no, there was nothing particular that drew me to that. I knew what it was getting in for. But 17, 18, you don't know what you're doing. I remember one time at Key West, the submarine I was on there was taken out of mothballs and made a target submarine. The torpedoes and the torpedo skids in both the forward and after torpedo room were removed. And it was filled up with wood except for a passageway down the middle and right up in front of the torpedo tubes and where you could go to the hatch was filled up with wood, just in case. They were actually shooting the fish to hit us. No warheads, of course, but I don't know how many dents we got. The acoustic fish, of course, they were designed to go to where the most noise was. And I don't know how many times we were in dry dock to replace our screws and our propeller shafts because they bent them.
Did you volunteer for this?
We had for a while, we had a TV camera topside so that we could watch these fish coming in at us. But one of the jobs that we did, we were testing direction finding electronics to see what was going on around the ship. And if you've heard of Fort Jefferson in the Caribbean, that was where they had the doctor that treated John Wilkes Booth. He was the only prison there for years. We got to go through that when we were there, but we sat down on the bottom. There was a small boat tied a line to our periscope shears, and for 3 days they circled us. Every 2 or 3 minutes they dropped some kind of a charge, depending on what they were wanting to do. Now, you're in a submerged piece of tin. Can you imagine what the sound like that was? You were ready to do anything to get up out of there. I can imagine what it was to be depth charged, because they were actually trying to kill you. But when they secured that operation, we tried to surface. We were stuck in the mud, 150 feet. So the rescue vessel with the rescue chamber was on its way out from Key West, and the skipper said, well, we're going to try something. Just like you would try to rock back and forth to get your car out of a mud puddle, he tried that. We blew all of their ballast tanks, and that didn't help. He was ready to blow all of the fuel tanks, just to lessen weight and get more buoyancy. And all of a sudden, that submarine broke loose from that suction, and we popped to the surface like a cork. Of course, we didn't know it. We had pressure in the boat, and that's... But there for a while, we thought we might have to make an escape through the escape hatch in barracuda-infested water. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, there is even a few alligators on that island. And we weren't too far from the island. We didn't look forward to it. One of those things you would have done just to get out of there. But it sure would have been a shame. It was a nice boat. I'm sure they could have salvaged it, but it would have been an expensive proposition.
What was the name of that boat?
The Manta, 299.
How did you happen to get that kind of duty?
I was on the Cayman, and we had been in February, if you can imagine, from Pearl to the Aleutian chain. We took UDT guys out, which is SEALs nowadays. A lot of people think that, submarine sailors are tough. Nothing in comparison to those UDT or SEALs. We were sissies in comparison. We would surface there off of one of those islands, just enough so that the conning tower hatch was out of the water. Those guys would get in the water, swim in 8-10 miles, do what their practice run was, and swim back out and find us. Well, when they got back aboard, they could have had anything they wanted on that ship. If they needed a bunk, they had it. As long as you want to sleep, it's yours. But from there, then we went to, when we operated out of San Diego for a couple of months, and at that time they were experimenting with a submarine with a big bubble on the back so that they could put a bunch of Marines in it and do amphibious landings. They had a landing craft in that thing too. And we were operating with her one day, and they were having trouble. And if your submarine is having trouble, they fire a red flare, which means get out of the area. The destroyer escort that we were with went right into that area, and the sub surfaced underneath. Right on the bubble where those 100 Marines were in, knocked it loose, but it didn't flood. So they had to submerge further, get that destroyer escort out of there, and then they came up again.
Did anything ever happen to the destroyer escort, Captain? Or
No, I don't know. I have no idea.
what a stupid thing to do.
Oh yeah, if you're operating with submarines, you should know the protocol. Red flare, get out of the area. I'm coming up on an emergency basis.
I want to ask you one question too here. This is getting away from other things. Was there a real closeness among the crew members on submarines?
Oh, fantastic. Anybody that has been in the submarine service may not consciously own up to it, but it's pretty much a cult. It really is. We're loyal to the Navy, but we're more loyal to each other. We knew that we were a very small, percentage-wise, service, less than 2%. In order to stay there, you had to meet certain requirements. You had to begin with, to go aboard, for whatever it was worth, psychologists or psychiatrists interviewed you to see if they thought you were suitable for that. The things you did were not routine. So we took pride in that. We're different. We stink too when we went ashore. You could smell a submarine sailor a block away. It was one of the reasons that we kept a barracks up on the base so that you could shower and clean up and have clean civilian clothes to go ashore. But we got along. Very seldom did you ever see a fight amongst your own crew. Once in a while it happened. The worst of the time, or worst time could have a fight, when we'd go to sea for a long period of time, they had payday poker. And of course one guy kept track of all of the who owed what for when. And when you got back to port, then you had to settle up. Well, there's always going to be one or two guys that disputed what he owed. And then there could have been fights over that. And I never got into gambling. Before I went in the Navy, a guy worked for my dad. And I probably was 13, 14 years old at the time. I had a job elsewhere from my dad. And this guy got me into a poker game one night. To this day, I swear he cheated me out of 50 cents. And from there on, gambling is not for me. I can go up to the casinos, and I can watch the people spend their money. I don't have to spend anything there. And sometimes it's just funny to watch the people. But that's a different story. I'm not for gambling at all.
You're in a very confined space. It's a very tight space with what you're saying, around 80 men. What kind of living conditions do you have personally when you're an electrician in lesser ranks like that?
We always had a warm bed to sleep in, which was great. Space was so limited on a submarine, as small as I am. If you wanted to sleep on your back, that's the way you crawled in your bunk. You couldn't turn over. If you wanted to sleep on your stomach, you got out and crawled in on your stomach. And if you had a big fat guy above you, it was worse. No, if there was space was limited. You had one little locker for your personal things. I don't suppose it was 2 foot square. And that's where you kept all of your personal stuff. Your uniforms, particularly your dress blue uniform, you put in your mattress cover under your mattress so that it stayed ironed. You folded it the way it was supposed to be. Your white uniform, they were starched, so you couldn't do that with them. And normally, your white uniform was kept in the barracks up on the base. Once a week, if your water distillery was working, you could get a shower. But you were limited to the amount of minutes that you can be in the shower. You had enough water every day that you could brush your teeth and shave. We had the best chow in the Navy. No matter how long we were out, we usually had excellent food. Set down to the noon meal and the evening meal, and normally you had a choice of 2 different meats. For the first month that you were out, you had fresh vegetables all the time, and you even had fresh milk for the first week, 10 days. Plenty of frozen vegetables. Our cooks were excellent. We had one cook that was an excellent baker, and after evening meal was closed up, he would spend the next 3 or 4 hours baking cinnamon rolls and eclairs and you name it, and we had it. No, we ate good. I really can't think of anything real bad about the submarine service, for me personally, except it did get old to be out for 2.5, 3 months. If you've ever seen a sailor that's been out that long, to see him walk on the pier after he's been out at sea for that long, you think of a drunken duck.
I was thinking of one thing, and I mentioned it earlier. Have you seen submarine movies and laughed at what you see in the movies?
The only one that I haven't laughed outright at was Search for Red October. They did some things that were possible. Knowing some about rescue bell, to be able to come down and attach to a submarine hatch, knowing that almost every country in the world has the same setup for the diving bell. Ours could fit Russian, French, German, English. It is conceivable to me that they could have some kind of a vehicle that they could overtake that submarine and attach to it. So that didn't seem to, and I've read a lot since I read that about things that the Navy did, and what they're talking about isn't the most secret stuff that they have. I remember reading about this is the submarine that I helped build, the Wahoo, going into Russian territorial waters, submerging over one of their communications cables, and sending divers out attaching listening devices to this cable, staying there for weeks at a time, collecting the information of what they were listening to. The divers, I forget the name of the term, but instead of just suiting up a diver and sending him over the side, for weeks before they were going to put him in the water at deep depths, they would put him in aboard this submarine. They had a unit where they could put the divers in and start cranking up the pressure on them, feeding them helium. And by the time they were ready to put them in the water, they could be, without a deep hard hat equipment, scuba gear. They could put them in the water 300-400 feet deep. And that just surprised me. And I read this in a Tom Clancy book. I've got a lot of Tom Clancy books. He's got a good reputation for reporting accurately. So there's all kinds of things that are possible.
You mentioned going into Russian territorial waters. How close is that to the shore, especially at depths like that?
A mile. 4 miles from the other direction.
So you're very close in, and
And understand, I wasn't on that.
Oh, okay.
But this is one of the
This is I was reading about this.
Oh, okay. But so submarines were, going very close to in places where they'd be surveilled.
Oh yes. Again, Tom Clancy, reading some of the things that our submarines did. The thing that to me is actually scary. Our fast attack atomic boats were so quiet, 1,000 times quieter than the Russian submarines. They could creep up behind a Russian submarine within a couple of 100 feet and not be detected. They would hide out in the ocean, and as the Russian submarines came out of the North Sea, then they would fall in behind them and track them for their whole period of their deployment. The Russians were aware that they were doing it, but detecting them, they couldn't do it. They didn't have the equipment. And their ships were so noisy, it drowned out any noise that the American submarine might make. One of the things that is scary to me, the Russian skippers got where they were doing what they called a crazy Ivan. And they would peel off either right or left and make us figure eight and come back. And that way then they could detect, because their bow equipment was facing that. And there's been an awful lot of collisions because of that. The one that sticks in my mind, this one that was the star of the Russian submarine navy, put to sea, they had liquid chemical propulsion for their missiles. Mixture with seawater was not only deadly but explosive. One of the guy that was in charge of the missile silos on this submarine was having a breakup with his wife. He went to sea knowing that there was a leak in one of these tubes. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, when this collision took place with an American submarine, it really ruptured that tube and flooded the submarine with not only chlorine gas, but whatever else was generated from, and killed a good share of the crew on that Russian submarine. Now, I was reading about it just after it happened because they didn't tell about it as it was happening. And believe me, I could feel every bit of their peril. Terrible. They're just men. Same way I feel about the German U-boat sailors. They were taking care of their country as they saw fit. And they're probably some of the best submarine sailors there ever were. However, their losses during the Second World War were atrocious. They lost over 300 boats, 30,000 men. And they still could get volunteers to do it.
When you're talking about these collisions too, was there a lot of damage to the submarines?
This submarine that, when this collision, that one I'm talking about, it's happened down near the Bermudas, was the very latest fast attack submarine going, called the Augustus, after Augustus, Georgia. The skipper was a cowboy. On his wardroom door, he had a sign, Caesar Augustus, which kind of gives you an idea of what kind of a man he was. This submarine was, the Russian submarine was still on the surface. The Russians did not want it to fall into American hands. Americans wanted it. So they finally got some Russian surface ships there and tied a line to that and was starting to tow it. This guy on the Augustus decided they weren't going to take it. So he went through between the sub and that one that's towing and cut the towing line. You know good and well he had to damage his boat. Then, that wasn't enough. He could see that they were transferring from the submarine to a lifeboat, to a merchant ship, a Russian merchant ship, all of the logs and the secrets of the submarine. He could tell because it was weighted stuff so that if anything really happened, they could toss it overboard and sink. This lifeboat is full of men, and he tries to ram the lifeboat. But between the cable and the crash, they took the Augustus back into port, relieved him of command immediately, and I think it was something like $12 million of damage to that boat. The boat was never put back to sea. It was scrapped.
The American public doesn't know.
No, doesn't hear about all of that. You've got to read some of the, this book over here on the counter, Blind Man's Bluff, is about this story. And that's a Tom Clancy book.
You were in, you went in before the Korean War started.
Yes.
Were you involved in any operations related to the Korean War?
Not really, no. We did some patrolling in that general area, but that's all. Nothing you could even say a war patrol.
The North Koreans didn't have any kind of submarine service, did they?
They didn't have much of a surface navy. I still don't think they do. They just got an atomic bomb. And starving people.
Yeah.
After 5 years, I married a woman that I met, and 2 weeks later we were married. Should never have done that. And that was the reason that I got out. I wanted to be married, and that didn't work out. I don't know that I really regret not staying in to retire. I've had a good life since. You know, when I got out of the Navy, I had a job to go to work for Pratt Whitney, manufacturing airplane engines in Hartford, Connecticut. And then I was accepted to work at the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut on the Nautilus. That's what I wanted to do. And I even had a chance, minimal chance, and minimal contact to talk to Admiral Rickover twice. I've read since then what a tyrant that he was with the people involved in his project, but he wasn't with the workers in the yard. He was really human with us guys. When the
hold on for just a second here. Just for somebody who doesn't know who Admiral Rickover is, describe what his significance is.
He is the father of the atomic energy propulsion system for the U.S. Navy, particularly for the submarines. There was slop over from the reliability on the submarines, and then it went into the surface craft too. Every officer that was in the atomic boat program was personally interviewed by Admiral Rickover. One of the things that he did was have a straight back chair in his office with the legs on the front end trimmed down so that you stoop forward. You were off balance before you ever was interviewed by him. And he had a way of phrasing questions that could go either way. You better know how he wanted an answer. And this is what I'm reading. I've not had any experience on that myself. Even though he was a tyrant, he knew what he was doing, and he did it well. The Navy itself never would have given him the Admiral's star. The Congress is the one that's responsible for him having his star. And even though I knew some of the stuff about him before, I wholeheartedly agreed with what he did, what he accomplished. It was marvelous. And again, after talking to him a couple of times, I thought he's a fine man. In fact, all my time in the Navy, the new minted ensign was probably more chicken than a full admiral. He had something to prove the admiral didn't. He'd already made his. I remember one time in Key West, you weren't supposed to, from your ship at the pier, you weren't supposed to walk through officers' country. But to the barracks where we had our civilian clothes and we could shower and all, it was so much easier to go through there. And this one time, my sleeves rolled up, hat in the back of my head, I was sauntering through there, met this guy on the sidewalk, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, he had 4 stripes on his sleeve. So I really did a real quick turnaround, and I was standing there saluting, and he was standing there grinning at me. He says, "Carry on, son." I could have been court-martialed, but I wasn't. I don't know, you hear a lot of stories about how mean some of the officers could be. We only had, when all the time that I was in, and the 4 different submarines that I was on, we had only one officer that was really that kind. And he was the executive officer on one of the boats, and he was of the 6 or 7 officers, he was the only one that was not an Annapolis graduate, Georgia Tech. And he felt like everybody was picking on him because of it. And they weren't.
Now, you talked about working on 2 submarines, building 2 nuclear submarines.
Mm-hmm.
What were those, and how were you involved there?
To begin with, they had me running cables all over I have absolutely no idea what any cable that I ran did. You went to the supply store and they had it tagged. They already knew how long it was supposed to be. You had a route that you were supposed to run this cable. And ultimately, I knew that there was now many cables I ran from the reactor area to the control cabinet. Just terminate them, just run them in there, and it had a number on it. Somebody knew what it was for. I didn't. When they found out and realized that I had some experience in submarines, they asked me if I would like to work in the full-size wooden mock-up. And what I was doing there, you'd have a piece of gear that had to fit in someplace in a general vicinity. It was my job to go on the Nautilus, measure the area that I had, and then go back and measure the equipment that was going there. And with the help of a carpenter, we designed a base to put it on, how to position it, and then once we got that done, it went to the metal fabrication and they made a copy of what we did. And that, for the last few months that I worked at EB, that was pretty much what I did.
So you felt you had a big...
You what?
You had a big interest then in the Nautilus.
Yes, I did. I did. From the standpoint of seeing the crew's quarters in comparison to what we had. On the Nautilus, they had individual bunks. They were actually little compartments. You had your own air conditioning nozzle in your bunk. You had a light that you could, and a curtain that you could close. It was your bunk. In comparison to the mess hall that we had, the Nautilus, I thought, was very spacious. Our mess hall aboard the old fleet boat was about half the size of this room. And 24 men at a time ate in that space, plus you had room for the mess cooks and the sink to wash dishes and prepare vegetables and all of that, and a passageway. We were crowded.
Other than the fact that the propulsion system being nuclear, what did that mean? What was the big difference between that and the kind of subs that you were on?
The old fleet boat, basically, when it's all said and done, wasn't a submarine. It was just a ship that could go down and come back up. We were limited on what we could do below the surface. That's because of the propulsion. We needed air to run any length of time. The nuclear boats are not limited with propulsion. They've got the atomic that's endless. They have equipment to manufacture air out of salt water. They can manufacture all of their fresh water out of salt water. They have bigger capacities for storing food. They have more, and to me this is a very important, they have more things to amuse the crew with. And believe me, you need it. They can go out, and I don't know how long they stayed out, but the food is the only thing that limited them, because the atomic power created their fresh water, their air, whatever they needed. Truly, the atomic boat is a submarine. It's a self-sufficient unit, can go down and stay down practically as long as they want.
Captain Nemo has arrived.
He's what?
Captain Nemo has arrived.
Oh, yeah. I read that book years ago. I'd already been in the Navy when I read it. even though it had been around a long time. I don't know when I became aware of it, but yeah, he had atomic power down. That's what it was all about.
So this was a real change, and you get to see this from perspective. Did you ever think about going back to the Navy when you started seeing what kind of submarines that they were going to be building?
I did, but still was married. In fact, I even tried to re-up about a year after I was out. I could have gone back in with lower rank. I didn't want that. Another one of the biggest regrets of my whole life was the electric boat company, knowing that I had been on submarines, when they were going to take sea trials on the Nautilus. It was a down the road a ways. They asked if I would like to be on one of the yard crew to go out with the sea trials. Oh, no, I've had enough sea duty. You think of what a feather in my cap would have been to go out on the first cruise on a nuclear vehicle? Oh, I kicked myself for years.
But it just wasn't right at the time.
No. Again, it was all tied up with this marriage that didn't work. But I left the yard before they did that, so I thought I was going upward and onward for something else. No, I sure wish I'd have done it.
Do you, or have you seen any of your crew members? Do you have reunions at all?
They have a reunion every 2 years. I was supposed to go last May. I had reservations and everything. It was in Reno at Circus. It would have been the first one that I would have been able to go to, or knew it when I could go. And the day we were getting ready to go out that way, we were going to go in the motorhome. And we pull a little car behind the motorhome. I was feeling bad enough because of the breathing, had my son come over and help my wife hook up the car. And while they were hooking up the car, I realized, hey, all I'm going to do is make an impossible situation for my wife. And that afternoon, instead of even staying home, I wound up in the hospital. So I had to bypass it. Got a new one coming up in 2012. They do it every 2 years, and it's going to be in Oklahoma City. So I'm looking forward to that one. I'm in touch with a lot of the guys that are in this group, and it's kind of a fluke that I got on to this having the reunions. Down at the museum where I volunteer, one of the guys that we work with, he and I got to talking, and we were talking about, well, he had a brother that was on submarines. And he said something, and I said something, and all of a sudden it dawned on me. I said, are you talking about the Cayman? Well, yeah. So then he got to telling me about the reunion that the Cayman was having. He gave me the phone number of his brother, and I've been in touch with them for years now. I would like to, the submarines that I've been on, I would like to accumulate ball caps. The only ball cap I've got for submarine is one that I didn't serve on, but I've been on. And that's the museum boat in Galveston, the Cavala, which is a sister ship to the Cobia. It's 244. So,
what was, just kind of in order, what was the succession of the boats that you were on? Just so you have
okay, I was on, to begin with, the 323, 299, and the 245, and then the 565. The 565 was a new class of fast attack, one of the forerunner of the atomic boats. A lot of the stuff that they had on there was really incorporated in the atomic boats.
And what were the names of these? Not just the numbers?
See, the Cayman, the Manta, Cobia, and the Wahoo.
And then, of course, the Wahoo being this more advanced, still a diesel sub, but it was a
It was, yes. Mhm. Even had a radical different type of diesel engine. Instead of the crankshaft being horizontal, it was vertical. They always had problems with it from the time we did sea trials on it. Never worked like it should have. They finally did change the engines. I don't know what they put on it. And the other day when we had the open house here, one of the guys that's a submarine sailor served on the Wahoo. And he was telling me that he was in the early 60s. And he said he'd been on it just after it had been depth charged by Russia. Never heard about that. He said lots of damage to it.
Do you remember his name?
No, I don't.
We can find out.
Yeah, well, we'd like to find that out.
I've been trying to remember it, but I can't.
We'll try and find out and let you know.
We'll look
Yeah.
it up. But, do you have any other questions?
Just one. I mean, you study submarines. You really have made this an interest of yours all your life. Where do you think we're going with submarines in the future, and how important are they to our security?
I think they have superseded any other seagoing vessel. And maybe the only others would be repair or supply vessels for the submarines. Something to refuel or resupply the food needs. I think, well, I'm not sure about the carrier. They've got planes now that don't need a carrier. That they've got long distance enough that they can go lots of distance. I think there'll be, maybe not in my lifetime, but I can see where they might phase out the aircraft carrier because they are big and expensive. They get more bang for the buck with a submarine. And I think they'll always need those for the stealth. The enemy never knows where they're at. And they can get their missiles, they can launch them from anywhere.
Do you have any idea how many submarines there might be in the Navy now?
None.
That's probably top secret, isn't it?
I'm sure it is. And I don't think that you could even find out. Somebody would tell you, and it's just speculation.
It was kind of a unique event this last Saturday when this exhibit in this museum opened. Is it interesting getting together with guys that served at different periods in the submarine service and different kinds of boats and swapping stories about your experience versus what they've done?
Oh my, yes, absolutely. It was very interesting. I learned, you mentioned me doing some research, and it's nothing like talking to the guys that's been there. Because they can tell you what really happened.
Were you aware of these other guys being here in the Denver area?
I'm amazed that there were so many of them. Another positive thing for me is they have a group that meets in Arvada, ex-submarine sailors. Next Wednesday, I'm going to go down and meet with them. And they have the spectrum of the whole unit. There's not very many of us old diesel boat guys left. Now, one thing I did notice, and I really don't know how I feel about it entirely. The nuclear boat guys, I think they did it all.
It's almost a kicker to this. Still fun to talk to them, though, isn't it?
So they think it all kind of began with them, huh?
Yeah. Okay, every once in a while, I know how to cut a guy off at the pass, and if he gets too mouthy, why, I have a comeback.
You don't mean to say that even the younger submariners have attitude, do you?
Yes, they absolutely do. Yes, they do. And they need it. Absolutely need it. What they do isn't routine. So you're going to have an attitude to be able to do it. The old fleet boats that I was on, I never even saw one, but I've seen pictures and read about them as the old S-boats, the forerunner of the fleet boats. They didn't even have air conditioner on them. Even some of them still were slinging hammocks to sleep in, which was like the old U-boats. The old U-boats, about the only one that had a bunk of his own was the captain. Everybody else slept wherever they could find a place to lay down. We had storage enough that we didn't have to store food and stuff in the passageways. But the old S-boats did. Just didn't have and the refrigeration, maybe for 2 weeks. And then you were on dried and canned stuff. And again, they got the job done.
You have respect for those U-boat crew.
Oh, yes, I do. Immensely. And only because they're men. They were doing what they thought they should for their country. Caught up in somebody like Hitler, what would we do? Everybody wants to feel superior to somebody or something, and he convinced those people that they were superior, that they needed to be doing what they were doing. There was the head of the German submarines is speculated that he was in on trying to assassinate Hitler. He was the guy that was finally the head of all of the armed forces in Germany the last few months that they were. But it was still speculated that he was in on that. But they couldn't prove enough for him to get shot. I had all kinds of admiration for the German U-boat sailors, particularly when you find out what their losses were. The last couple of years were terrible losses for the U-boats. And I know what it would be like to die on one of those things.
Anything else at this point?
No, I don't.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and we appreciate it.
Just one, that very thought, let's just carry it on. We need to wrap up here, but that's something that never comes up. Was that something you thought about a lot?
I have, yes. This is my own thinking on it. Do you remember when the Russian submarine, the Kursk, went down? I bled for those guys. Why don't they do something? Why don't they let some foreign country in there? We had the equipment in the era that we could have saved a few of those guys. But they were so afraid that we might see something that we shouldn't, that they sacrificed them. You read about how the submarine Squalus, which was an old S-boat, how much energy and money they spent to get those guys out. The Thrasher, there was no way they could save anybody off of that, because it is deep enough it imploded. As a sidebar from the Squalus, the Scorpion, I think it was the first submarine on scene or the first vehicle on scene to try to help the Squalus. Well, when the Squalus was salvaged and put in the yard, they renamed it the Flying Fish. And the Squalus went on to, the other boat went on to the Pacific, and it was sunk by the Japanese. Some of the survivors were taken aboard a Japanese warship. The ex-Squalus, the Flying Fish, came along and sank that ship. Just a kind of a sidebar of war, what can happen.
A little sidebar that we can fill you in on is when the Squalus went down, they started to develop some primitive equipment to help get people out of at least shallow water. And we met a man about 8 years ago named Clay Decker, who lived in the Denver area. And he was aboard the USS Tang, which went down in 180 feet off of Taiwan. And they used this equipment. Out of the 80-some people who were aboard, only 9 of them made it to the surface successfully. He was one of them. And they used this equipment that was developed after the Squalus went down, called the Momsen Long. And he was able to get to the surface along with his captain and a few other people. Most of the others didn't make it. And then he was taken prisoner aboard ship with a number of Japanese sailors whose ship the Tang had just sunk. And they endured some very harsh.
I think he was in the Bataan Death March, wasn't he?
No, he wasn't.
No, he wasn't?
He went down in October of '44. The Tang was apparently the most successful individual boat of the war for the Americans. They were on their 5th patrol, and they were actually sunk by their own torpedo, which malfunctioned, circled around, and hit them.
Mm-hmm.
And they had fired their last torpedo and were about ready to run for home when this happened. And they had a very successful patrol knocking out commercial shipping. But we interviewed Clay for about 2 hours. And Clay actually has donated some artifacts to this museum. He passed away a few years ago. He donated some artifacts to this museum, and we have his interview in here as well as an example of somebody who was one of only, at the time that we did the interview, there were 4 guys left alive from the group. And we just found out this last week that one of those guys, that the rest of them passed on. The one guy passed away last week. There's 1 left.
You mentioned the Momsen Lung. Every year, to stay aboard submarine, you had to make a practice escape through the escape training tank, 100 foot. Ultimately, in order to qualify, you had to make a free ascent from the 100-foot level with no lung. And that was, to begin with, realizing you were going to have to do it, that was scary. What could happen if you didn't slow your ascent down and stay behind your bubbles? You could burst your lungs. One of the guys aboard the Cayman, ahead of me, I wasn't on the Cayman at the time, but I was at the sub base. I was just waiting to go aboard. Panicked on the free ascent, closed his mouth, and of course it ruptured his lungs. They took him in the elevator down to the decompression chamber, but there was nothing they could do. His lungs were gone. But yeah, that was scary with the first time you got out there from that depth. And
that's something Clay Decker talked about extensively, about how slow they had to come up and how they had to take their time. And even if they were just barely below the surface, they still had to do that, because even 10, 15 feet below water, that could still happen. And one of his best friends was somebody that came up the last few feet too quickly, hit the surface, and that's exactly what happened, and he had to let him go. He made it to the surface, but the lungs burst, and he had to let him go. and that was probably the thing that hurt him the most.
Yeah.
Is watching that man go away, go under.
Yeah, a lot of people don't believe it when you say from 100 feet, it took close to 5 minutes if you followed your bubbles. Yeah, don't close your eyes. Keep an eye on those bubbles. But there were divers in that tank at almost every level. If you got in trouble, normally they could grab you and save you. But this one guy, I don't know why they missed him. But once you start up, man, you're moving. They took a balloon at the 100-foot level, and they just tied a knot in it. Really wasn't a balloon, but it was a rubber thing. And take it out, this to show you what happened to your lungs. And the instructors would take that out to the 50-foot level, and it was that big around. Didn't blow in it or anything, just tied a knot in it. So you know good and well you could be in trouble. One year, my wife and I, after I retired the first time, we ran away and joined a circus. We were advance promoters for the Carson and Barnes Circus. What we did was go to the towns ahead of the circus, about 6-8 weeks ahead of them, and did all of the promotional work. It was very interesting. It was a lot of work. In 6 months, we covered 14,000 miles. And I think it was in 14 different states, too. And it got pretty old.
Wasn't exactly settling down.
No, it sure wasn't. But it was fun. It was interesting, and not everybody can say they ran away and joined the circus.
What'd you do then?
Well, I was driving by the Boulder Tech school over in Boulder, and I thought, well, see if they could use some volunteer work over there. I stopped by and talked to the people in charge, and about 2 days later they called and said, well, would you be interested in working for us for pay? Instead of, and I worked in the collision repair division of the Boulder Tech for 5 years. So again, I branched out, but it isn't as silly as it sounds, because I knew how to weld. I knew all kinds of power tools, and knew how to handle them, could teach kids, and hand tools. I'd been using them all my life. The school thought they could see that I had something that I could get along with the kids. I wasn't sure that I could. You see them in the mall, and some of them are a mess. Some of the kids in the school were a mess. All you had to do was listen to them. Don't pass judgment. Just listen. And you had friends. I think I was treated more like a surrogate grandfather than anything else. And not once in the 5 years did I have one of those kids try to insult me or downgrade me in any way. They would confide in me things that they didn't even confide in Mom and Dad. They knew that's as far as it was going to go. Most of it didn't even go to the other teachers that I worked with. They could confide in me and know they've got a sympathetic ear. And I loved it. I should have been a school teacher.